increases, but because of that money, now you actually is able to say go to a course. Wouldn't you actually argue that Q should increase? If you got more money, you're spending that money to do something, so Q does increase because of that higher availability. Why does P always have to increase and Q remain constant?
Q will increase eventually, but in that instance, it doesn't. And what you think is, unless your economy is expanding, so if you have a population boom, yes, you're going to have that. But generally, on average, you're going to have a set, for every one person that enters the labour market, you would expect one person to be retiring or leaving the labour market. So you've got to think, this is the economic capacity of your whole economy. So yes, if the economy increases and becomes more productive, yes, you'll get more goods and services. How much?
2 minutes.
So I'm going to go through the rest very quickly. So what happens if there's a recession? The reason why we're in this situation that we're in right now is when you're in a recession, you want to have access to your cash. You feel less confident with lending it out, so you withdraw it from a bank. And just as we saw that, it's an inflationary process when you put money in your bank and you lend it out, taking money out or recording your debt is actually, you're destroying the money supply. And if you go back to our equation here, what should normally happen is, as we had inflation, you should have deflation. But in practice, when you're in a recession, no one does that. No one slashes their prices of the goods and services they do. Even more so, the QI includes your employment because you're selling a service. No one says, okay, it's a recession, I'm willing to accept a 50% cut in my salary. So in practice, this doesn't decrease. In practice, what happens to compensate is this decreases, which means that businesses don't sell as much as they do. It means people get unemployed. And this is the biggest problem with a recession. I'll have to quickly skim through this. But that's also why banks are desperate to prop up the money supply. And the way they do this is they keep going on, obsessing on about consumer lending. Banks have to lend, banks have to lend. People have to borrow money. The reason they have to is because they need to satisfy this equation and stop this price collapse. And that is why, at the moment, they're desperately trying to keep the money supply up by printing money. I'm going to have to rush through because I want to go to the Islamic Alternative. What is the Islamic Alternative? If we go back to our example of the person who has excess cash, he has two options on it. If this cash is sitting idle and he's not doing anything on it, he pays the zakat. And this zakat is used to go to people who need the money. His alternative is to invest the money. Islam doesn't say you have to pay zakat. You can't. The alternative is you invest that money. And if you invest that money, he can choose to invest it into the people who need it. Investing money doesn't mean he lends it, or it could mean that, but typically what it means is you invest in people as equity, or as you share their profits, or you share the losses together. Just quickly go through this. So basically, it's effectively a wealth tax. What the zakat funds are used for, the Quran clearly specifies exactly what this money should be used for. The poor, the needy, the treasury, or the Bayt al-Mal as we've known it through Islamic history. So this is zakat collectors, it actually funds the administration of that, the people who collect the zakat. It also helps towards new converts in need of monetary help, slaves, captives. In the modern age, that means helping third world nations, as those unable to repay their debts, and interestingly, travellers in need of help, because the Quran describes travellers as vulnerable people. That is why, one of the reasons why we read qasr, why we're allowed to shorten our prayers when travelling. I'll quickly mention this as well. I find this very interesting. We've always known that zakat is something that is as 2.5%. But Khalifa Rabi, he's of the opinion that it's not actually, he doesn't find any reference or fixed percentage of the Holy Quran. And he's of the opinion that it's not actually, this 2.5% isn't It's just one number that you can choose, but he says it's up to basically the Baitul Mal to decide what the rate of zakat should be, and it should be adapted as per the needs of the economy. And to sort of contrast how zakat would operate in a recession, or how things would work differently in a recession. When you do have a recession in this sort of system, zakat rates, Khalif al-Abi talks of this opinion, that zakat rates could be relaxed to allow some breathing room to those who have money. They don't have to invest in what is potentially becomes more risky prospects. So you could lower the rates of zakat. But because more people are ultimately going to be keeping their wealth, what's more likely to be the case is you're going to collect more zakat funds overall, even though you do lower the rate of zakat. So those who need it will be paid out of this zakat fund. And once the economy is ready and ready to start growing again, that's where Baitul Mal could increase the zakat rates to encourage more investment. But when it's in a state of recession, the first point is people need some breathing room. People need to take stock of what's exactly happened and not make rash decisions. Sorry, I'm rushing through this quite a lot. So what are the sort of interesting areas of future research in this area? We've seen zakat work in Islamic history, but only in a very early part of Islamic history, when we were basically in a sort of merchant capitalist type market. So what it means is it operated as you didn't have sort of big, you didn't have this sort of division of labour, you didn't have this concept of big commercial markets. So there's a big area of legal framework that needs to be done. So in the modern day, if you imagine if you're going to start implementing this, a lot of work needs to be done in how you're going to invest that money into the equity side of business. So I find it very interesting that USA Jamaat, they've started this new project called, is it Al-Islam Exchange, ALM Exchange? So I don't know if Hassan Saab, you know a bit more about it. So they're spending money on legal experts to help create this exchange where people who've got money can invest in interesting Islamic proposals made by entrepreneurs. But there's a lot of work that probably needs to be done. Other areas, it's like the question is, what is the role of investment banks? In my opinion, we often say that investment banks are a very evil part of this society. In my opinion, investment banks are going to be very important in the Islamic economy, because you need a mechanism, an exchange where people who've got the money ready to invest, to exchange it to someone who lives on the other side of the country. So I think that's a very interesting area.
Surely in an Islamic system, all banks are investment banks, to some extent.
Yeah.
There's not really a significant difference between a regular bank and an investment bank when the banks have to invest.
Well, the only difference is you wouldn't have a retail bank, because the purpose of a retail bank is somewhere you can deposit your cash.
Right, but how are they making money?
Yeah, so you wouldn't necessarily have that, or you wouldn't have banks the way we do. What you'd instead, but yeah, investment banks would be the same, and all banks would be investment banks. I totally agree with you. But it's they would operate in a lot different. They would operate in a different framework, because you're going to have a new sort of guidelines, new governance that Islam has very sort of strict criteria that is different to the way we operate necessarily today. Another interesting question I often ask myself is, for the Islamic system of zakat to work, does it require the society to operate under a high moral standard? Can it operate in this economy? Sometimes I think no, but when you talk about some of the other guidelines that the Quran talks about specifically, and how we should operate, and how how one should deal with business with each other. It talks about some specific guidelines. So I think that is something that needs to be considered. You can't just say to economy, right, we're going to implement zakat, and go off and run off your own. I think these are all sort of important things to think about. I'll finish and then you can ask a question. I think it's the last slide. So what other economic mechanisms could come into place? One thing Fasani that has pointed out is, zakat. He was the opinion that zakat may not necessarily be enough to provide for the needy. So he points towards wasiyat as being a very important aspect of the future, where wasiyat will play a role not just for expanding for tabligh purposes, but also to help the needy and effectively provide a welfare state. And he almost describes it as the state will use this. This is a way of a means of a way of this. Not necessarily. He doesn't go as far as saying the state, but the funds will help. Well, actually, he does describe it as the state. The way how the state will be able to accumulate wealth in order to provide all these services in the future. So I think that's a very interesting area that I think is going to unfold over the next few decades. I think as we look into it, as I think the seed really becomes important. And the other interesting thing is, how do the levels of zakat, how would they operate? I think that's probably going to come later on. So I touched upon Khalifa Dabi's opinion that zakat isn't a rate that's stayed at 2.5%. What situation would you raise the levels of zakat? What situation would you lower it? And what should be the form of money used? Today we use paper money, which that's what it is. The money that you use is paper money. There is no guarantee on it apart from what the central bank says. The central bank says, here's a £5 note, go use it as money, and trust in us that you'll be able to use it as money. So that's another important question. And how should public finances be raised? So in the earliest times of history, a lot of how public finances were raised was through direct appeals to the public that, look, we've got this campaign coming up, we want you to give contributions. Or through spoils of war. The early Islamic civilizations were able to accumulate a lot of wealth that way. But it's not clear how that will happen in the future if the Jamaat is going to progress. And it's we have the ultimate victory of Islam. How will all of a sudden the state come in place and have public finances? Because the way the current world works is, if a government wants to build a hospital, they issue a bonds. They borrow money to build a hospital. They want to build a road, they borrow money to build a road. I think I have to wrap it up. Yeah.
Okay. So thanks very much for the talk. I think it went on a bit, but I think it was really, really interesting. I'm sure there's going to be a million questions. So we've got to stay up, I guess. We'll answer about 10 minutes of questions.
2 minutes?
We'll make 10 minutes for sure. So because there's a lot of questions, and I'm sure it's going to become a discussion, so we'll just do very quick questions and I'll kind of pick a couple of people. Okay. Otherwise, Okay, so go for it.
All right. A very, very, very insightful presentation. I want to know, it's like I got a little confused between actually the concept of zakah, and if you look at it from an Islamic perspective, I see zakah to be in a different league, and Islamic banking and its principles to be on another league. I mean, with Islamic principles of banking hinge on riba and other concepts of it, as opposed to zakah, which is obligatory.
So basically, I'm on the opinion that everything you see in Islamic banking in today's world is not Islamic banking.
Yeah,
it's not Sharia compliant.
Yeah.
They just basically replace interest with the term profit, and does exactly what the Quran says you shouldn't do, and they do it anyway. Where Islamic banking in the future will be more relevant is how you're going to create this exchange where people who've got cash can invest in people who need cash. So you've got the stock exchange. That's an example now. But if you're someone who needs to open up a shop, how are you going to? You're not going to float on the stock exchange.
Yeah.
You need an investor in you to come into it. So how are you going to do it? It may not necessarily be an investment bank. They may be called different types of institution. It could be funding. It could be a fund that invests in you. It could be a group of funds, but that's my vision or my understanding of what it could be like in the future.
Did you had your hand up before?
Yeah. How does interest increase inequality between the rich and the poor?
In a nutshell, you have inflation. Inflation basically says how the value of money changes. So $100 today is not worth $100 tomorrow. It's going to be worth $101. If it was worth $101 in 1 year's time, that's 1% inflation. Interest rates, when you borrow money, you typically have to pay a rate above inflation. So effectively, you're having to pay more than what you borrow, even in terms of after correction for inflation. Those who lend money are always compensated above the rate of inflation, essentially. Those who have money are guaranteed profits, and they'll become, by this equation, they'll become rich. Those who need money, they have to not only make it with whatever they're doing, they have to do it at an even higher level to compensate for the fact that they're already effectively taxed. It's like it's a tax directly on those people who need the money, so you're effectively taxing the poor.
Okay. So the rich have their bubble kind of expanding fast, and the poor have it effectively shrinking.
Yeah.
Could you say the poll part again, please? So it was quite clear how the rich people would get richer. But could you explain again how the poor, so with regards to inflation rates and interest rates?
So if you think of it in terms of, if you compensate everything in regards to inflation, even if you take inflation out of the picture, you've got to pay, obviously you've got to pay more than what you borrow. Right? So effectively, you are being taxed in some sense. So you're being burdened with this tax that not only have you got to repay what you borrowed, but you've got to repay it at a higher level. So all of a sudden it's a subtle, it's not easy to explain in a few lines. But it also, it is a direct tax, and it means it's a subtle push that, if you need money, you've got to do a good, even better job than you would imagine. Sorry, I didn't describe that very well. I'll explain.
Yeah.
So two quick questions. One's like, do we have any example from the past where we had this vision of Islam that you're presenting, that this is how people would invest as opposed to giving loan? One. The second question is that if we have a kind of a global currency where the total currency is fixed, then do you think the injustice and the disparity between the rich and the poor, and then the banks making money on debt, would it kind of at least decrease?
Yeah, so first part of the question, yes, the early Islamic history did use it. I'm not much of a historian, but the early Abbasid period, they didn't have investment banks. They had something called like a merchant capitalist economy, you can say. So those who were wealthy, they created private houses where people who wanted to become a trader, for example, that was the common way where you borrow money. They'd go to them and say, look, I want to become a trader. Can you lend me either the money or the goods so I can go sell it and we can share the profits? So that's how it operated in the early history. And we all know, and it operated very successfully. Trade really flourished in the early Islamic history. Just implementing zakat and having one global currency, will it solve all the problems? I don't think so, because Islam gives a lot of guidance on how you should conduct your business. And it wouldn't, and there's a reason. There must be some wisdom behind it to do that. So I think that goes hand in hand. So we've got an example with how Sharif Saab was talking about Africa as an example. Yeah, their free market is working. They're operating on a free market, but they're operating under very sort of immoral standards without any proper guidance, corporate guidance or corporate at all. So that's an example where I wouldn't expect it to work. So you do need that legislative side of things as well.
With recession, isn't that more of a product that it happens so often of the economy based on usury? And if the economy is based on zakat and other and wasila and stuff, would recession happen at less frequently, or why would it? What would cause it?
You get two types of recession. Recessions that are created from something that's gone wrong. So it could be a natural disaster or something like this. Those will surely happen on a zakat-based system as well. The difference is in a zakat-based economy, you've got more breathing room to regroup and move forwards. In a usury-based economy, when you get a recession, your money supply starts collapsing very quickly. And when your money supply collapses like that, people lose faith in money, and that's when you get bank runs. And in those situations, you're in big trouble. And the only way out of it is either by printing lots of money, or getting an external influence to invest money, or to go invade another country and take the spoil.
Okay, I think we're going to have to call it stop it there. This is why it's telling me off. So, thanks, Luqman Bajwa. I think it was a really interesting presentation.
I apologise if it was a bit rushed.
No, I think it's a really big topic and hard to difficult to manage.